My name is John Bryfonski. I'm the Chief of Police here in Bedford, and I'm also the Vice President of BeBOLD, Bedford Building Our Lives Drug Free. And thank you for all coming to tonight, January 23rd, 2017 presentation series. Tonight we have Diane Vaccarello, who is the owner of Bedford Family Therapy, who's going to talk to us about kids and stress. There's been a number of studies dating back as far as 2008 that significantly link stress in young people and adolescents with drug abuse. In fact, in that study, the study found that out of 6,000 teens, 73% said that the #1 factor that caused them to experiment and use drugs was in fact stress. That's a significant and remarkable statistic. Conversely, only 7% of the parents interviewed said that they thought that stress could be a factor in causing their teens to become involved in substance misuse. So we have since 2008, a number of additional studies that continue to link substance abuse and stress in young and old people, job stress for adults, as well as school-related stress and other coping stress issues that young folks have. So tonight, Diane is going to enlighten us all about that topic and tell us more about it. Diane, thanks.
Thanks, Chief. Hi, everyone. Thanks for making it out tonight. And as Chief mentioned, there is a significant link between substance misuse for teens and adults as well, and stress and also mental health. So I wanted to focus tonight on really the signs and symptoms, as well as the solutions for how to address the stress levels in our society today. And it's a continued conversation from an earlier presentation that we've done with regard to substance misuse and the effects of stress on the brain and the combination of those. So the solution aspect is really what I'm hoping you walk away with some thoughts about tonight. It doesn't mean these are the magic answers to anything. You know, it's really one of those things where it's more about changing sometimes our patterns of thinking, and that's what I'm looking to sort of support a process around. So how many of you were able to attend the presentation by Judge Broderick this past Thursday? Oh, so maybe a third of the audience or so. Some of what he is doing through the Change Direction program is really important, because the whole concept of that is notifying early, basically identifying early signs and noticing some of those symptoms in children and in teens. And the other most important thing I think his mission is to also break down the stigma, which is something I'd like for us to continue that conversation around even in tonight's presentation. In order to gain access to the supports and the resources and the help that a lot of us need, and a lot of kids and teens need, is to be able to access that without the judgment and the stigma attached to, receiving mental health services, or just really getting into challenging conversations with one another, within a family, with friends, with other, caregivers in the community. So those are pieces that I really want us to keep in mind tonight as we move forward with this conversation. So one of the things that Judge Broderick mentioned is, and I'm really reinforcing this because it's in a lot of the literature, is that 50% of kids and teens with mental illness show signs by the time that they're 13 or 14 years old, mixed 13 and 14 age groups. But adults, that's usually the onset, at least 50%. By that early age. So it's really important that we're looking at the younger ages, and that's something that at BeBOLD we focus on, grade 4 through 12. A lot of this, you can also take with you for younger kids, and then for yourselves, as adults. So, but some of the specifics here are really aimed towards 4 through 12. We're going to have a period of time at the end for question and answer. If you have a question while I'm in process, don't hesitate to raise your hand. I'm open to taking questions as we go. Okay, so 3 groups of symptoms I want us to really focus on, because it ranges, but the emotional, the physical, and the behavioral. And obviously some of these symptoms can be typical ones that, you know, don't necessarily mean that a person has anxiety or that they have depression, but that they might be in distress and experiencing stress. And it's not universal, it's a customized kind of thing. Each one of us is a little bit different, but these are some common ones that I see people report, both the kids and adults. But kids in particular, so the emotional with anxiety, depression, signs of agitation and moodiness. If you recall from Judge Broderick's presentation, he identifies 5 signs, and I'm just expanding on that a little bit further. Adding that physical category of some of the aches and chest pains, stomach in particular, and a lot of the reason for that is because you know, when our brain is in distress, there are certain chemicals that get released into the body, and oftentimes they go to the stomach. So cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, those are adrenaline is oftentimes associated with anxiety or with a surge of fight or flight, meaning that our brain is feeling like we're in harm's way. For some people who have anxiety, or for some people who really struggle with managing stress, that response is looped. And so they're consistently experiencing levels of cortisol or stress hormone, as well as you know, the idea of adrenaline, which is not meant to stay in our body for a long, long time. You know, we're supposed to kind of use it when we need it, and then it leaves our body. But if there's a looping, that's where it kind of wears our body down a little bit. So I just really want us to associate, you know, understand the mental and the physical components with that. So behavioral, eating less, procrastinating, nail biting, a variety. This is not an, you know, all-encompassing list, but these are some common ones. Obviously, using alcohol and drugs is where it comes in that, you know, Chief was talking about the idea of sort of coping with the distress, and that's something that can alleviate temporarily. The idea is that we're looking for relief. We're constantly looking to feel better, and so some of these things are maybe temporary ways, some of the behavioral to feel better. Eating less is associated with when we're in fight or flight, our blood flow and all of that, it goes right towards the torso, or, you know, not out to the extremities, not to the stomach. I mean, we are like needing every bit of energy, I guess, in that moment that we can get, so it doesn't waste it on our appetite. So these are all tied back to sort of caveman days, you know, the basic building blocks of what keep us safe. But the thing is that we don't need to have that running all the time. So let's move on to fear. Again, that idea of what keeps us safe. You know, fear serves a good purpose in that way. It also helps us focus. If we have a little bit of anxiety or worry around something, sometimes it can help us do something that we're preparing for, whether that's teaching something or a presentation, whatever that might be. The fear is also, though, the culprit to cause oftentimes a lot of chronic anger and depression, as well as anxiety. Fear can isolate and distance us from others. That question of, am I safe? It doesn't always come out that literally, but it's along the lines of, am I safe? So some kids and teens are asking, you know, they have fear of something from dying to not finishing a test to, you know, not being able to comprehend something and feeling like, what's going to happen. You know, fear of the future is often associated with anxiety, and worry about the past is more associated with depression, generally speaking. So it's important that with regard to fear, we provide, sorry here, I'm trying to change the notes on this page here.
Diane, when
yes.
you said fear of the future, I just keep thinking about, you know, I'm a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
The pressure of talking about college and AP class, you know, they're all choosing their classes now and all that, like, you know, having to be an outlier and doing something to make you stand out, and all this pressure that they're feeling with regards to being successful and getting into college.
Yeah.
How do we, in this fear place, deal with that?
So obviously the idea of those future kinds of things, that's going to be on a lot of our minds. It's pretty typical. And this doesn't happen, I mean, it happens with kids, even if you insightfully talk to them about the fact that they don't need to worry about, you know, what they're going to do for a job in the future. It doesn't stop them from necessarily doing that. But what they're needing in that sort of space is being able to turn to someone, because that's what we do as humans. We have a longing to connect and to attach and to have those. In an earlier presentation I've done at McKelvey School, we talked about mirror neurons in the brain and how you know, we reflect if a person is sort of saying to us with their visual or nonverbal that we're okay from a young age, as an infant, as a child, as a teen even. Oftentimes our caregiver or a teacher, we're looking in their eyes, is everything okay? And when we get that reassurance back from some of that nonverbal or verbal, it helps us to convey a sense of safety, you know? So when we're having conversations with our kids and they're bringing up concerns about that, we do want to talk to the brain part of things, and, you know, and I'll actually get into that a little bit further. But ultimately we want to connect sort of a positive sensory experience with that fear. So letting them know, you know, that how to break it down and focus more on the present, what they can control in the here and now, not so much what they need to worry about in the future, because a lot of that is stuff that we can't control. You know, it doesn't mean it's not a building block towards, but focusing more on the present is really more, you know, mindfulness. I'm sure you've heard a lot of that, you know, the benefit of that, but it really is because we're focusing on what we can do about a situation in the here and now. So it's problem solving, it's reassurance, you know, that's really an important focus that we take with kids, but that's a common concern that comes up. Speaking of commonly reported teen stresses, schoolwork, parents, I mean, future could easily be put in here. Romantic relationships, friend problems, younger siblings, these are the kinds of things I hear over and over from teens. We had the benefit of getting sort of some really fresh off the presses, firsthand reports from 10 and 11-year-olds in the state of New Hampshire, and they've identified on these green papers what they feel is really stressful for them. And so I just wanted to read some of those examples. When asked the question if you could confidentially let grown-ups know what stresses you out, what would you say? These are some of the responses. And again, keep in mind, you know, 5th grade, 6th grade ages is what these are. I noticed that with teens, and, you know, let's say 7th, 8th, and then on up, it's more as though they're still experiencing some of these, but then we're talking about compounding layers, like, you know, getting ready for SATs or getting into colleges. And so we really want to be mindful that stress can accumulate and build up, and so we need to sort of let some of that out in order to make more room for new stresses. It's not like we can, you know, after you leave here tonight, you can create a bubble around your kids or your teens and say, this is, you know, you're just, if we have insight, we can lead to change and create a safe space around stress and not be stressed. No, stress is going to happen to us. We actually can become stronger by experiencing distress, but learning how to cope with it and learning what our signs and symptoms are and knowing what your own kids' signs and symptoms are, it's going to keep coming up. The idea of repetition in parenting is obviously really important, right? I mean, we don't just download like a computer. We have to be reminded if there's new situations that we have to translate the scenarios to. That really makes for a more well-rounded, flexible kind of individual when they can experience multiple kinds and layers of stress, but they learn how to handle a different situation in a similar fashion because they know what works for them. So that's what we're going after. So getting back to this question, I just want to read some of them, and there were quite a few repeats, so I've tried to pull some of them out, but I wanted to also give you a flavor of what is, you know, really also repetitive. All right, so, and I'm going to specify gender here, and that's not always the case, but I just want to point out in some future slides that there are some differences with how we can think about responding. Of course, this is not a compact set of groups here, but a boy, just for anonymity, doing something extremely boring stresses me out, so boredom. What really stresses me out is listening to my dad's shrill yelling voice at any time. grades in school and getting a good education and being successful in life, similar to what you were talking about, Joy. Because we need to have what our parents have, what if we fail? So I want to point that one out because, you know, we need to have what our parents have is understandable that a kid might think about that, but it's also a bit of a false belief because, you know, and we have to sort of poke holes in some of those false beliefs when they come up, or even if it's not poking holes in them, it's really asking kids to think about, well, what if we don't, right? What is failure? What does that look like, right? A lot of open-ended questions so you can actually get to what the concern is that they might have. Oftentimes kids feel really reassured when you can go along with that fear, face it, you know, brainstorm around it, and it's not that you're coming up with solutions, you're just trying to say, all right, if your fear is, you know, and I actually had the chance to talk with this particular child and ask them, you know, if your fear is that you're going to, quote, fail and not have what your parents have, what do you think that would look like? And they said, I'm going to be on the street. Well, when we talked about that for even just 5 more minutes, they really recognized they're probably not going to be on the street. I mean, that could happen, yes, but then what would you do? You know, what are some thoughts you would have? That's where they just come out the other side of it. It's not avoiding it. It's not, you know, saying, oh, you don't have to worry about that. That's when kids just kind of shut off that idea of processing their emotion and they just tuck it away. And that's something we want to keep from happening because that will build up. And again, eventually that's going to tip over. There's many more stresses to come, right? So homework, too much information, teachers yelling, homework on weekends or Mondays. What stresses me out is labeling 3 high expectations. Lots of people like to call me names that even though they think it might be funny, makes me not want to come to school the next day. Too high of expectations, doing 120 things in 2 weeks. And they're counting, perhaps, I'm not sure. It feels like I need to do it even at 11 o'clock at night. A math or science problem that I can't figure out. Early rising, long days, lots of homework. These are sort of typical things, right, that you would imagine kids saying, but these are the kinds of things at those ages that, you know, they have on their mind. Let's see, friends, being tired, Gram and Grampy, yelling, waking up early, being timed. Pressures around time definitely come up often. Long-term assignments stress me out because I lay it off thinking, oh, I can do this later. I'm not good at planning, so I don't do it thinking I can do it the day after or the next day. And then the due date comes. You can see where this is going, right? It's sort of that anticipatory anxiety that's building, and the more the individual is thinking about it, the more they're feeling that distress, and then it gets to be an overwhelming point where they just ultimately say, I'm going to fail. You know, so it's that leading from one thought to another, and we'll talk about that as well. So I could go on here. There's some really interesting ones. Maybe at the end, if we have time, we can go through some more if you'd like. I think it's really helpful to be aware of what, you know, kids and teens are saying in our own area, right? And these are genuine responses. They knew it was going to be confidential, and you know, I think that oftentimes people think kids are less stressed than they are, perhaps, and but surveys and confidential kinds of things usually bring out a more accurate picture of what some of those things are. Yes, Joy?
Sorry.
No.
I'm sitting here and thinking, can you imagine going to work all day and then coming home and having to go back to work?
Mm-hmm.
And all your activities and all that. As parents, how do we, I mean, it's just the reality of being a 10-year-old now.
Yeah.
As parents, how do we manage that? How do we manage all of that and the schedule and the time and their stress?
Right. So, you know, as if we end up reading more of those, you'll see another significant theme that comes through is feeling overscheduled, feeling like they have school, and then when they get home from school, one of these, if I can look through, it was talking about, you know, waking up early, going to school, having chores, going to after-school activities, having more chores. I mean, I'm a fan of chores in a lot of ways, the sense of, having responsibility and all of this. But when we're talking about feeling like there are no minutes left in the day or throughout the day for free and open space, for thought, for doing nothing. A lot of times kids actually don't know what doing nothing is, and they don't know what to do when nothingness is there. And that's okay, because it's okay to have some struggle, but it's also important that they move through the struggle and start to pull together what their natural state of being is. And that's a big part of this, is that we're getting away from our natural state of being. As adults, we can do that. We can forget what it is that charges our battery up. And it's different for everyone. Some people charging their battery, going out and doing something, or staying home. I love to knit. Like, it charges my battery, no joke. It's something that I can do with my hands, and there's different things for different people, but sometimes doing nothing, is stressful for a person until they understand what they enjoy. And so it's really important that we talk with our kids and have them also identify for themselves what it is that charges their battery, meaning makes them feel comfortable, relaxed, recharged. Those are really important things. And sometimes kids can say, yeah, I have fun doing these other things, and I'm stressed, or, and, it's not an either or. Sometimes it's an and with kind of thing. Tracy?
So do you think sometimes parents do overschedule because they're worried that their kids will have too much free time and fill it with things that they shouldn't do?
That, absolutely. And again, when we talk about fears, right, and we talk about sometimes false beliefs, I'm not entirely saying that's a false belief, but that's not every kid or every situation. And I think we are worried about that as parents oftentimes, but maybe we could cope with our own worry around that and say, okay, if that happens, what are we going to do? What's our plan? Or what are some backups to the thought that I have? If I have this thought that pops up into my mind, what can I replace that with, or offer for myself as a suggestion to offer my child, right? And those are the kinds of coping strategies we're talking about helping our kids build. We need to build those within ourselves as well. Does that make sense?
Kind of manage those choices, free time and activities with your child.
Well, so I think that offering choices, or maybe asking if they want to brainstorm some ideas, but some kids might be okay not brainstorming. Some kids might be okay, but obviously one of the comments was being bored. But maybe that's an area where that child could learn a little bit more about how to be bored, and what bored, they might really just be uncomfortable because they don't know what to replace that with or what to do, because it's just really unfamiliar,
Do you notice that? Because I kind of see it in a lot of kids and my own sometimes, just having a phone, everything, so like
Yes.
they didn't grow up in an era where they're not instantly accessible or check what's going on, and it's like I say they're addicted, like it's an addiction, because if you split up, you literally have to say shut it off.
Yes.
Shut it off.
Yeah.
A lot of them feel like, like it's anxiety, like what happens if I miss, because teachers, get in touch with them that way, or their friend, like it's just everything's so instant. So I just worry that that's what their brain is being trained.
Yeah. And I'm going to repeat some of that just so it picks up in the camera as well, that, if we're talking about technology as well, and the idea that, filling one's time with that can also become maybe addictive, or, it keeps them sometimes from branching out and thinking about other things that they can be doing. It also sometimes affects sleep patterns, I think it is a good idea that you commented around, sometimes it is about limiting that. Sometimes it's about creating space for that. I mean, it really depends on the family and the child and what's going on. If it's too much, it can sometimes interfere with that idea. One of the children commented about procrastinating, and that can sometimes go hand in hand, but that's a life skill that they need to learn how to manage. So, but it's okay to allow it to become a bit of a problem before we step in, because if we're managing to the point, like Tracy's comment was, you know, should we be scheduling their free time, or how does that work? There is such thing as overscheduling. If we step in too much, right, then they're not going to learn how to do that for themselves. But it is important as parents. I often say, you know, one of the greatest gifts we can give our kids is to kind of get out of the way as parents, oftentimes. But that doesn't mean a hands-off approach. It means guiding. It means coaching. And you know, when we notice, I'm noticing that you're pointing out those patterns. And you know, what are your thoughts about that? What are your, you know, how do you think that could look differently? It really is about having them slow it down and think about it and have things be purposeful instead of they blink an eye and 4 hours have gone by, you know, and then they're panicked because they're up late or they didn't get their work done or whatever the case may be. But they have to kind of feel some of that first in order to decide that that's not helpful. Okay, so external causes of stress and technology could absolutely go on here, right? It can also be a source of ease for some kids, you know, having some wind down time that's a different part of their brain that they're using. But major life changes, kind of an obvious one, work and school, relationship difficulties, financial problems. That doesn't necessarily mean not having money. Sometimes it means having money. Being too busy, children and family. Internal causes of stress, chronic worry and pessimism, rigid thinking and lack of flexibility is a big one. And that's something that, you know, there are different people are on a spectrum with this, but there are ways of, you know, increasing flexibility and rigidity, and a big part of that is our own way of being in our homes as well, and trying to, you know, not sweat the small stuff, and just having an ability to let something roll off, even if that's not our first reaction. We can identify and say, you know, I think I'm thinking about that too rigidly. It's okay to go back and have a mulligan or do-over. You know what I mean? Like ourselves, it's okay. It doesn't mean our kids aren't going to trust our word. It means that they really think that we're thinking about things, and we're asking them to slow down their processing. As adolescents, the teenage brain is much more likely to be impulsive, so that's something we just have to do, you know, as a model for them oftentimes. The negative self-talk, being more positive, you know, in general can be helpful with that as well. Unrealistic expectations, perfectionism, an all or nothing kind of attitude kind of lends itself to that rigidity if it happens over and over. These are some of the gender differences that I notice in practice, which translate also to some of the other issues that sometimes are expanded upon mental health-wise down the road. So boys generally tend to use avoidance and distraction more often. Girls tend to look for support and actively try to reduce their stress. They often also report more stress than boys, like on a scale kind of mechanism, largely related to relationships with boys and friendships or friendships with girls. Boys attribute stress more towards authority figures like teachers, parents, and coaches. Those are some pretty research supported as well as in practice that I've seen. So what I see that translates to sometimes with girls looking for support and actively sort of trying to reduce their stress, they're turning towards friends, maybe girlfriends or something like that. And if those friends are not present or not, again, that the mirror neurons not reassuring, that can be really, really stressful for girls because they're looking for that, they're not getting it. And then they're like, oh no, what am I going to do? And whereas with boys, that avoidance or distraction, if that distraction is taken away, that sort of leads to more of that panic. What am I going to do? Whether that's a video game or you know, whatever that might be, it's like the taking away of that. We have to talk with kids about how do you replace that? If that's not available, what do you do instead? Again, it's that idea of what's next, what's the backup plan, and that does help them to recognize that it's not the all or nothing way of thinking again. But you know, with girls, that there is a link with you know, we've heard about suicide rates and things like that, and with girls in particular around not even bullying, it's sometimes referred to as bullying, but when they're looking for some support and they feel like that's their last source they can get it at and they don't get it, that's when they're like, I don't know what to do. And I'm not saying that it leads to that kind of an extreme situation, but that's when you funnel back, that's oftentimes the case, is that they've been cut off or felt isolated and withdrawn and alone.
Another question.
Yeah.
Do you find, I mean, you meet with a lot of different families as
Yeah.
your practice. Do you find that our generation, at least I feel, I'll just lay it out there with all of you, but I feel like in our house, we do a lot of telling our kids as opposed to asking our kids. And I just wonder if you see kind of a trend with our generation of parents and how they're raising their kids. I mean, I feel like our time is so limited because our kids are so scheduled with homework and activities and everything. That we don't have that luxury of the conversation.
Absolutely. No, I think that's that, you know, when we did the presentation at McKelvey, it was talking also about Generation X, which is a lot of our generation being one of the more stressed out generations and really achieving, very involved, you know, and as a result, our kids tend, you know, have been also a very stressed population as well. But yes, it is about not really even having the time or making the time, carving out the time to have those kinds of conversations. And if nothing else, I mean, we're getting to the tip section, and I know I'm trying to be mindful of time, so we, you know, but we're doing question and answer while we're going with the flow of this. But the, you know, it really is about slowing things down is easier said than done, right, with the kind of fast-paced world that we're in. But it really is crucial that we prioritize making time to have those kinds of conversations and to have space where there's free or open sort of time to play, I guess, for lack of a better word, because that is what's missing in a huge part. You know, it's the overscheduling, the trying to do for them, I think is a parental response around saying, I only have this much time, I'm just going to skip those pieces and get right to, you know, I guess more bang for our buck. You know what I mean? Like in that sense. And that is pressure on us, right, as parents, which is then going to roll off mirror neuron with our kids, you know, and so we're under crunch with that. And we just want to, you know, do what's most, I guess, effective. But that's not necessarily setting them up successful. And I'm seeing that that's a significant problem. It's a significant problem that is something we can do differently. We have to sort of focus on our own coping strategies to be able to tolerate the distress that's going to come with that. But I know that we can do that. We're capable of doing that. So here are some things that tie into that. Tip 1, encourage expression of emotions. And yes, I'm a therapist, I'm going to talk, you know, but I actually don't like to talk about feelings. I call them the F word. It's because they come and they go. They can be sort of crazy making, you know. It's important to talk about thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, but we need to, and we need to respect that, but we also need to not just get caught up in the muck and the mire of that. So what does encouraged expression mean then? Well, if your child says they're worried, for example, you don't want to say, you're fine. You know, we want to be reassuring, right? But saying you're fine isn't that reassuring. They're worried, they're scared, they have some fear of, at some level, core level emotion. If you say something like, you seem like you're scared, what are you worried about? You know, that open-ended, that kind of starts that conversation. What are you worried about? And maybe they're like, oh, I'm not worried at all. And I'm like, well, I notice, you know, this certain behavior symptom or whatever. Where do you feel it in your body? You know, and oftentimes if you can go to where they're feeling it in their body, they can start to tap into what it is that's going on in their body, which is like an alert system, you know, just like pain is an alert system, that there's something going on. Some of these symptoms tend to be alert systems. And if we just go right for the solution, you know, they're skipping through the whole process of what it is that they're feeling in their body physically and emotionally. And then you can get to, the thinking, because that negative thought pattern can be really helpful or really destructive. Stressed out kids really get lost in negative thoughts and self-criticism oftentimes, and that leads to worry about the future. Relaxation techniques, those are things that we have to teach ourselves, that we need to teach our kids. You might already be able to think about some things that you do that help yourself relax. Breathing, I mean, that's something that people talk about in yoga and all these things, but the breath is the central location for sending a message to our brain that we're okay or that we're not okay. So when we're breathing shallow and rapid, it is changing the amount of oxygen we're getting. It provides more of a tunnel focus, you know what I mean? Sometimes that's good when we need to have that surge, when we're actually in danger. But when we're just thinking about being in danger, and we're not, and then it can minimize our ability to think rationally and clearly. So we need to be able to slow the breath down, slow what's going on in the body, so we can actually, again, focus on actually scheduling in fear or scheduling in relaxation. Those are all things that we have control over. Scheduling in fear is something that, sometimes kids will sort of chuckle when I talk about scheduling in fear. And I'm like, no, for serious, you can decide, I'm going to be worried about that for the next 17 minutes. I'm going to set a timer, but we need to then talk about how do you replace this thought with a different thought. How do you do that? You need to practice that, right? And so they will get better and better. They're very capable of learning how to do that. And when they can schedule in fear and kind of time block that, they can say, oh, this is not my fear time. I have that, tomorrow at 2. I know it's not exactly as simple as that, but it gives them the idea of, that they do have control over those things. Let's see. So that self-criticism leads to judgment, which just further exacerbates anxiety. So that judgment place, and if you hear them talking that way, can really, again, is there something you're worried about? I mean, it's like open-ended questions. It's okay to be imperfect. Good enough is good enough. These are things that people who work with me hear me say over and over. I can't say them enough, though. Are we saying these to our kids? Those are things. Good enough is a really important sort of concept to really be introducing to them. And notice and appreciate life's good stuff, right? The things that are going on that are good. We talked about the rose and the thorn before. People have heard me talk about that. Even the bud, what you're looking forward to. Being able to experience all 5 of our senses. Again, it goes back to that biology of if we're in fight or flight mode, a lot of the other sensory layers shut off, or they're altered in a different way. If we are able to enjoy a meal as a family, for example, and we're, maybe even have music going on. I mean, all 5 senses, smell the cracked pepper on our plate. We're able to see, what's in front of us. Though, if we're experiencing all 5 senses, we're probably not very stressed out in that moment. It's a good sign that we're level, we're baseline. Those are things that we want to use as indicators for our kids. Like, are you noticing all of those things? If they're really not noticing a lot of the 5 senses, then it probably means they're also pretty stressed out. So making and finding time for free play, it needs to be a priority. Overscheduling, overstimulating can hinder intelligence rather than help it. I think a lot of times, again, we all have good intentions, but good intentions aren't going to cut it here. We need to recognize that, having more isn't always better. It doesn't always equal smarter. It doesn't even equal more successful. Some famous people I like to talk with kids about, James Watson discovered the double helix, the DNA strand, and he apparently had that insight during a good night's sleep, like one of the best night's sleep he had. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity came to him when he was daydreaming. A lot of kids actually don't daydream as much as you would think that they did, or maybe that we used to. I remember daydreaming, especially in a car, looking out the window, driving up to Vermont to see Nana and Grandpa, and I love daydreaming, but it's like now I have to actually try and daydream, schedule in the time to do that. Newton's theory of gravity, seeing an apple fall from the tree while he was lounging in his mother's garden. So, you know, those are things that really important things that have happened during relaxed states and during total open and free time. So when we think about intelligence being associated with more, that's not always the case. If we're on overload and overstimulated, our brain is not processing, nor are our emotions online. And we begin creating a persona layer almost versus that true self or authentic self. And that persona layer leads to problems later on. We could have a whole conversation about that, but it's important that we get to our natural self.
You mean like the selfie?
Yeah, not that. But yeah, no, it's presenting an outer, yes, a persona self, yes. Yes, that's not the authentic self.
Like what Krista was saying.
Yeah.
You know, maybe we're to schedule no cell phone time.
Right. And what is it like being with yourself? Those are kind of open-ended questions that, you know, we can ask our kids and they can be thinking about. Let's see, so it's also sometimes referred to as the relaxed alpha state. That natural state is a relaxed alpha state. That has to do with the brain waves. So again, it's really science-driven. Music, it's interesting research that's a bridge between our right and left hemispheres. Baroque music in particular lowers the heart rate. It's been scientifically proven. It moves at 60 beats per minute, so it's syncopated with your own heartbeat, and it's associated with higher test scores because it actually calms the mind, relaxes your brain, higher test scores. I mean, if you think about it, again, it's the relaxed state where we benefit the most. A good night's sleep, very, very successfully related to, you know, better outcomes with regard to stress. Biological clock shift, especially during adolescent stages. So a lot of teens prefer to stay up later at night, sleep in later in the morning. That's just sort of physiologically based. But again, we need to really support that as much as we can, and I know that's a tough one for a lot of people, but sometimes if kids and teens really, again, it's talking to their brain, helping them understand why it's beneficial and how, and again, it's asking, what's that feel like? You know, it's not just saying, getting into a power struggle about sleeping. Let them feel really lethargic and pretty crummy, you know, and go to school and feel how that feels, and like, what was that like? You know, it's asking those kind of questions. Again, you can't rescue them. So it's about teaching them. So tapping 3 resources, the ability to understand and use nonverbal communication is important, but it oftentimes if we're in a rush, we're really just transmitting verbally. We're not slowing down to look at the nonverbal messages. It leads to a higher level of emotional intelligence, which is often more successfully connected with lower stress levels. Supporting a greater capacity for experiencing joy. Joy, I always love when you're in the audience right there. Joy is numbered when emotions like anger and fear are blocked. In other words, it's really tough to have joy be front and center when the other emotions are taking over. So the ability to resolve conflict in ways that strengthen relationships rather than destroy them, those are really, I mean, we could talk about any one of these, but these are ones that I really feel like are important for us to be supporting our teens and kids with. And again, if you're sort of at a loss for brainstorming, draw upon another parent, ask a friend, talk to your own parents, talk to your siblings, whatever you need to, you know, and maybe a therapist, you know, talk to, or maybe support your kids in talking with someone. But again, it's sort of more in that sense is better, you know, the brainstorming aspect of how to support in these areas. But these are really, if we could tap into those resources, I think that would be really beneficial. Being a part of the solution is, you know, breaking down the stigma, like I mentioned, the vulnerability layer. It's really important that our kids experience being vulnerable to the degree, not that they're just like dropped into the deep end of that, but that we have moments of vulnerability where they can experience the distress, and then we can support them in how to tolerate that. Yes?
Are you an advocate for, I was speaking with a child psychologist, and she was saying that children, you know, in their young teen years do really well with options and choices, and like allowing them to pick 3 things, like, or you give them 3 things and they can pick the one that they want to do. Are you an advocate for that, or do you feel that there's too much control, parental control, if they don't have the ability to reach out and find out, because sometimes they pick something that isn't your choice, and if they find themselves that that really wasn't the best choice, so maybe next time that I would pick something different. In breaking down that whole thing where we're trying to control
Right.
their mindset.
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is if it's better to sort of give kids 3 options or something of that nature versus telling them what options we think would be better. So I'll answer that by sort of a developmental model teaches us that from the time we're young, really young, like 3 years old, and you're saying to your toddler, don't touch that right there, and then they're like, you know what I mean? And they're testing that limit, and that it looks different a little bit, but it's the same idea when they're a little bit older, and maybe somebody says, you know what, make sure you don't step in that puddle right there, or whatever that might be, or whatever, and they walk right in it, and you're like, I actually gave them a really clear instruction and they didn't listen to that. But the goal of kids from that young age all the way through is to have autonomy and to be individual. We're really, ultimately the goal is for them to differentiate from us, and so they're not necessarily always trying to just be twits or anything like that, and they're really just trying to, sometimes they are, certainly there's behavioral layers, and you know that that's happening, but sometimes it really is tied to that developmental goal that's very strong. They're not they're not thinking about that. So I feel compelled to use the developmental model as a couch for like what we're talking about, because you can give them straight up ideas. I would prefer the concept of, letting them know, maybe not even saying don't walk in the puddle. Let them figure that out naturally, that having wet socks for the rest of, that time really doesn't feel very good. If you do give them a heads up on that, and they do it anyway, again, there's some natural consequence there, and that's really important for them to experience in life. For them coming up with their own choices, I feel like we need to think about this as a continuum. Again, it's customized. Every kid is a little bit different in terms of how far along they are with differentiating. So if you have a child that really needs more of that support, I would say, then yes, that might be a nice approach to use. But then see if you can keep moving that. So at some point, maybe it's them coming up with some of those choices, and you can kind of have veto power over one, or you can let them have the natural consequence. And sometimes that teaches them even better. So I don't feel like it's a one-size-fits-all, and I don't think it's an all-or-nothing answer to that one. I think it really depends on what your kid is needing. If we rely on that only, we're going to miss a range of kids. That's not going to work for it, and we're also going to pigeon them into this one part of the spectrum of growth that they really need to experience, so that by the time they get to, high school and they're differentiating and heading off to college, they actually won't be super stressed. I mean, that's another really high stress point. I get a ton of phone calls about that transition heading into college, or that first semester, January, after the first semester of getting to school, because they just are not prepared, because sometimes it's because they've also had so much of that structure. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so I feel like based on the time, I'm just going to do one more slide, which is, managing your own emotions, decreasing over-parenting, but certainly being coach and being helpful with kind of open-ended pieces. Allowing your children and teens to fail is okay. We obviously don't want them to fail in the biggest ways. We need to have them start with small ways, so they can kind of successfully build up a tolerance and an ability around that. Encouraging sleep and making small, sustainable changes. Keeping that sort of positive self-talk and motivation within the household is also really important. So hopefully there's something there that fits for those of you in the audience. Yes?
I have a child who does not like to go to bed at night. like a night owl, and, you know, and I'm always trying to say, okay, we gotta go to bed, we gotta go to bed. And I feel like I'm always structuring him to get to bed. And he'll dilly-dally in his room, and, you know, finally he'll end up going to sleep. But, you know, even if the days that I don't see anything, he is exhausted next morning. But, so he's not learning from that mistake, but I feel like I am always controlling when he goes to sleep.
Yeah.
Because I usually say, okay, lights out at whatever.
Yep. So a couple of thoughts on that, and it might be helpful for others in the audience to just think about when you mention dilly-dallying in his room. It's important, again, the science behind this is that if we are spending a lot of time in our room space, which is where our bed is, which is where we sleep, if we're doing homework in our bed, you know, or things like that, our brain needs to associate the bed with sleep. If it associates the room or the bed with other activities, it's not going to have as easy of a transition winding down and getting into that mode. And that's why it's important, you know, that the lights off, not a lot of heavy electronics right before bed. It's a different thing that it shifts in the brain with a circadian rhythm. There's a lot of science behind all of that stuff, and the idea of having a sleep routine is really helpful. So that might be something that you could think about starting at a certain time without it being too long, because then kids are sort of like, you know, they wind back up, you know, if there's a lot of activity. But having some type, maybe having a dialogue and saying, and you know, this, it's really important for your brain health and for your growth and development, maybe showing them some of the science behind that, and you know, having them be a customer for that is also important. They might be a night owl, and they might really continue to be in some senses naturally, but you know, helping them to find other places, even in the house, to do some of those things, so that when they get to their room, they're ready for thinking of that as sleep.
So they shouldn't do homework on their own, because that's the week.
I mean, I'm not a fan of that. If it's physically, that's where it makes most sense to do that. You can still make a transition from the workspace to bed, you know, but maybe not a lot of just dilly-dallying in the room, because that's going to, again, that's not work time. That's like dilly-dally time, you know what I mean? So it's, again, it's how we can support our brain in getting clear around, this is what I'm doing with this, and this is what I'm doing with this. Because I think for a lot of times kids, that space is mixed, and that, you know, I hear that often. And whether it's homework in the room, maybe that's okay for a kid who is like, this is my workspace, they do it, and then they're doing something different. But I would have different spaces for different things. So play time or electronic time or whatever is not like they're at their desk where they do homework, and is not in their bed where they are supposed to be sleeping. It just helps to clear the boundaries on that. Any other questions?
Thank you. I've asked this question before at some other events, but once again tonight, there's two things I remembered. One thing was Plan A. When Plan A fails, there's 25 other letters. You know, so kids should know that there's 25 other options. The other question I was going to ask, though, is in other sessions, we've not talked about the role of spirituality with our families and in our kids. We talked about creativity, which I think is excellent, but spirituality also helps with creativity. And so I don't know why adults seem uncomfortable talking about that subject.
Yeah,
Thanks, John.
I certainly don't feel uncomfortable talking about it. I think it's really important that you continue to bring that up, and that we continue to incorporate that. And again, our way of not only that it's important, but it can be a source of easing distress for a lot of people. So again, with this topic, that is, you know, there are a lot of wide range layers to spirituality, and even with the idea of connection, the human need, number one, is for us to feel connected and for us to feel loving and loved. So with spirituality, that oftentimes serves a purpose for people in that area, and in connecting with other people as well, in a community of spirituality. So it does tie very much into that idea of feeling connection and not feeling isolated. And so that's mentally a very healthy additional layer. It isn't necessarily everyone's layer for what creates their charging their battery aspect, but it is for a lot of people. So it really is important to identify what layers of the spirituality experience are serving that purpose, and what layers can actually duplicate or replicate a lot of other people who are involved in different things can actually experience distress from it or stress from it. So it's important to differentiate, our own customized experience with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Diane, for being here tonight. I wanted to bring up one comment that maybe you can elaborate on just a bit. And at the school level, one of the things that we try to do with kids when they express feelings of anxiety is we talk about how to normalize those feelings. I do it at home with my kids, and then we do it at school if a child comes to the office and says, I'm just so stressed out, this happened, and helping them to understand that what they're going through is not abnormal, that they're not alone. Can you maybe talk about that just for a minute?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's really important that we do that for ourselves too. And I talk about that a lot, of being kind to yourself, and reminding our kids to be kind to yourself is also sort of tied to the idea of normalizing that this is a really, are you aware that that's a really common kind of thing? And with school related, it can be with a lot of things, but with school, how common it is for kids to be stressed out when they've had a break and then they're coming back to school and trying to get back into the groove or into the mode. And if that's something that your child is experiencing, it's important to let them know a lot of kids experience that. That's pretty typical. And, to help them understand, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them, but there are still some ideas on, brainstorming what you can do, or just recognizing it's going to be a rough couple of days, and that's okay too. We'll get through it. That kind of reassurance. But the normalizing goes a long way for that. Yeah.
So, Diane, let's kind of bring it home and end up where we started in talking about a little bit about BeBOLD's mission and the connection between stress, anxiety, and the risk of addiction. And we know that there's a strong neurobiological connection between those risk factors. And so, listening to your talk and listening to some of the questions from the parents and the folks here, a lot of questions about what can we do as parents, what can we do to try to manage, help that stress at home, right? But yet, I'm faced with the question, which is, for me, the chicken and the egg thing about stress. You can have the greatest, easygoing, connected parents in the world, and yet still have a child, a young adult, a teen, getting ready to go to college that is just wildly stressed out, right? And so, isn't it the external factors? I know when I was reading the research before tonight, that 2008 study, said that for the first time, school was the major factor that kids identified as being stressed. But before that, the major factor was, quote unquote, being cool and being part of the group.
Peer pressure.
Right. And so how do parents deal in a world that is designed to create stress? Because that's the culture that we live in, right?
Right.
We live in immediate gratification. We live in a world where the technology allows us to send a message so that we can get liked back, that releases some chemicals in our brain and make us feel better. So we send more messages so we can get more responses and more likes. Right? And so it seems like we're building a culture, right, and a society that is just building stress into it as a major component, and it doesn't seem like there's anything we do. What can parents do to prepare their kids to deal with that external world?
So your point is a really important one, because again, the thing that we were talking about of feeling needed or loved or connected, that's a really important human kind of need, but also the need to feel pleasure. Right? And so that idea of joy or feeling pleasure, so sometimes the idea of a dopamine response, to having a like, and that in an addictive sort of sense, but it also, the equal amount, if not sometimes greater, and depending on the circumstances, of stress that it brings with it. That, you know, it used to be before the technology, you know, the idea of if you don't want something, you know, said or on the front page of the newspaper was a really effective way to present that. Well, with technology today, there is absolutely no retracting. There's no waiting to, you know, print the newspaper. I mean, it's immediate. So the gratification is more immediate and the stress is more immediate. And so, again, the idea of slowing things down, and with the impulsivity, and you know, that's something that teens are just going to be amped up to do because of the way their brain is developing at that stage. But as parents, we really do need to talk with our kids about slowing things down and really having second thoughts and really delaying the response, like count to 10 or see how you think about that the next day. I mean, those are strategies that are important ones for them to build as they're heading out into their own lives as well. And we figure those out sometimes the hard way or the wrong way. I'm not saying in a severely hard situation, you know, like having something on social media and then the social consequences that come from that can be so harsh, and sometimes you know, it can really demolish like a sense of self or a person in that moment. So there are times that happens, and you know, I'm not sure when you're saying what as parents can we do about that, we have to really bring to light some circumstances that happen. I think people's real life stories are impactful for adolescents and kids and teens. One of the series that we're having next month is actually having a dad and a son come and speak and tell their story. And I think when people are brave enough and courageous enough to step out and tell their stories, sometimes our ears open up even more. You know, we're realizing these are people within our community, within our you know, circles, and I think that's sometimes something that kids or teens slow down and pause to listen to a little bit more than it always coming from us as parents. But really talking about those natural and circumstances and consequences that can arise, that is something that sticks with kids oftentimes, you know, but it doesn't always translate. So that's the challenge.
So to sum up, it would be making sure that we don't create stress in the home and be attentive to it, and yet talk to our kids about those external stress factors that are going to be there, that we have no control over, that are going to happen.
Right.
And prepare them, talk to them, educate them about the fact that these things are going to cause you stress and anxiety. But if you talk about it as a parent, isn't that an effective way of reducing that anxiety level?
Right, because we're talking about lots of layers of stress as we go. If we think of the cup filling up and filling up, one thing can really spill that over. We need to be sort of draining a lot of that out as we go, right? Creating more space for more stress, because we're not going to be able to escape that in life. But if we can figure out how we recharge our battery or drain out that space to create more space, that is where we can, a lot of the research really supports that people can endure a tremendous amount, right? We're actually quite resilient, we're quite strong in those areas. We do it more effectively when we can have intermittent periods of joy or relaxation. So, you know, the studies really show that you have the same sort of setup, and somebody who doesn't get that intermittent joy or relaxation state or that alpha state, they can't tolerate that as long. But people who have that in between can tolerate that longer and then some. So that says a lot, I think, for just the high idea of, you know, we need to have space in between.
Diane Vaccarello, thanks so much. Bedford Family Therapy, thanks so much for coming and visiting with us and sharing your insight. I'm sure Diane will be around after the presentation tonight for a few minutes to talk. And if any folks have any additional questions. I am John Bryfonski, Chief of Police and Vice President of BeBOLD, and I want to remind you that next month's speaker series will be on Wednesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m., not on Monday. And as Diane indicated, we're going to have a special presentation. Oftentimes we hear about the tragedies, and the media is filled with stories about young people, young adults, teenagers, adolescents, and even older people that have succumbed to addiction. Well, we're going to have a success story on the 22nd. And we're going to have the dad and his son, who was arrested by Bedford Police Department, and as a result, went into treatment. And they're going to talk about how they got there and what happened, what brought them through, and I think it'll be really important and insightful for folks to listen to that story from a personal perspective. So join us February 22nd, 7 p.m. here, again, for the Be Bold speaker series. Thanks so much, and thanks for joining us.